Welcome back to the OFFbit, the show where we love playing around with computer hardware, old and sometimes newish. Like today's video, we have the AMD Ryzen 5 2600 that we're marrying with the Nvidia GTX970. Now, if you haven't subscribed to the show and you like watching people wrestle and analyze the performance of different systems and their hardware configuration in relation to games, then this is the show for you. Now, we'll be putting the Ryzen 5 2600 and the GTX 970 through its paces today, both in our synthetic benchmarks and analysing how well the system does in a few relevant title games for 2021. So stick around and find out how well this system does. The AMD Ryzen architecture has been something of a nightmare for Intel, but a dream for AMD fans and system builders who have been longing for a competitive market once again. AMD officially announced Ryzen during its New Horizon Summit on December 13th in 2016. Officially the Ryzen 1000 series, which launched on March 2nd of 2017. AMD's first architecture was called Zen, followed by Zen Plus, which is where the Ryzen 5 2600 falls under. The Ryzen 5 2600 was released in April 2018. This CPU is a Zen Plus processor, as we've previously mentioned, and based on the AM4 platform. Constructed on the 12nm node and has a base clock of 3.4 GHz that can boost up to 3.9 GHz. Comprising of 6 cores and 12 threads with 16 meg of L3 cache, Ryzen really made Intel rethink and were pushed by AMD to start putting more cores and threads into their own CPUs. Previously, 6 cores and 12-threaded CPUs for Intel was only ever available in their high-end desktop or server-grade systems. The Ryzen 5 2600 has a TDP of 65 watts. This chip is a great budget-buy chip and could be purchased in 2020 as little as $200 Australian dollars. This CPU was my go-to budget chip, giving you a reasonable stock clock and a value-crushing 6 cores and 12 threads for a rough $200 in Aussie bucks. This here is the Nvidia GTX 970 by Asus. This version of the GTX 970 is the Strix-GTX 970-DC20C-4G DD5. This GPU is based on the Maxwell 2 architecture. The GTX 970 was released on September 18th of 2014 under the GPU code of GM204. This GPU is built on the 28nm node from the TSMC foundry, having 4GB of GDDR5 clocked at 1753 MHz. The GTX 970 is famous for having the controversial 3.5GB fast memory and 500MB of slow memory, giving it a total of what we said 4GB of RAM. The GPU is clocked at 1140 MHz by default and can boost up to clocks of 1253 MHz. The GTX 970 has a TDP of 145 watts. Supported APIs by the GTX 970 is Direct3D 12 and Direct3D 12.1 feature level, OpenCL 1.2, OpenGL 4.6, and it does support Vulkan version 1.1. The RAM we're using today is from G.Skill. This is the Aegis F4-3200C 16S-8GIS. This is a single 8GB kit of DDR4 RAM, rated to a max speed of 3200 MHz. Now, it's probably worth pointing out that this RAM has a fake heat spreader. Well, it's not metal. We here at the OFFbit are unsure what sort of thermal properties this thick like sticker has, but it ain't copper and it ain't aluminium either. The motherboard we have today is the ASRock B450M-HDV R4.0. This motherboard is an entry-level B450 chipset motherboard. The B450 motherboards generally let you overclock the main CPU bus, which overall clocks the CPU. This motherboard supports 2 DDR4 DIMM sockets, has one PCIe 3.0 x16 slot, one PCIe 2.0 x1 slot. It also has 4 SATA 3 ports and an Ultra M.2 port. This motherboard comprises of 6 USB 3.1 ports, 2 on the front and 4 on the rear, and it also has a GB LAN port on the back with 3 audio jacks. For our drives today, we are using our usual drives. We have a 120GB Western Digital Green SSD. We have a 240GB Western Digital Green SSD as well. And finally, we have the 1TB magnetic hard drive by Western Digital as well. We are using Windows 10 build 1909 installed on the 120GB SSD drive. Now we're formally introduced into our hardware. Let's crack into some of the benchmarks. First up, we jumped into CPUID's CPU-Z. The R5 2600 Ryzen scored 434.3 points for its single core score, which is just behind the i7 6700K with 465.7 points. Now the 6700K is a beast of an i7, especially for its single core performance. Something AMD has struggled with many years and just lately really closed in on Intel. The Ryzen 5 2600 took the cake for the multi-core score with 3,470.6 points. Now remember, this is a 6-core 12-threaded CPU. It did beat the i7 3930K, which is also 6 cores and 12 threads. In the 7-zip benchmark, we had a similar outcome with the R5 2600 pretty much coming second place for single core score and multi-core score pushing out way in front. We saw the Xeon X 5680 pop out in front with the multi-core score, so that's a 6-core 12-threaded CPU as well. So this benchmark is showing those 6-core 12-threaded CPUs quite clearly. Finally, the last benchmark we're running for the CPU is Cinebench R15, and the Ryzen 5 2600 scored 1,265 points, pushing out way in front out of all the CPUs. Now this benchmark really does show you that this CPU just loves video editing or any type of 3D CAD sort of stuff. The 6 cores of 12 threads and the core strength all put together just give you a great score. Now there are better CPUs on the market these days, but I still really like the Ryzen 5 2600. It is still a great bang for buck chip. Moving on to the GTX970 and Cinebench R15, the R5 2600 with the GTX970 scored 96.75 frames, scoring better than the same video card with the i7 3930K. In Unigine heaven, the R5 2600 combo with the GTX 970 scored 1,768 points. This combo is still quite in front, but did fall behind the 3930K with the same video card. Quite an interesting outcome for the benchmark because the i7 3930K is nowhere near as quick as the 2600, so obviously this is favouring the Intel instruction set more than the AMD. Finally, 3D Mark's Firestrike, we scored with the R5 2600 comboed with the GTX 970, 10,242 points, which is about 100 more points than the 3930 with the GTX 970. Pretty much the same card. So, looking pretty good. This card is pushing quite well ahead of everything else over the GTX 770s, the GTX 660, and so should it be. Now we've done all the formal stuff, let's jump in a couple of games. First up, dropping into the world of Cyberpunk. What I can only describe as a bitter disappointment. We are running version 1.06 of Cyberpunk and our frame rates are just abysmal. We first tried running the game at 1920 by 1080 and well, we did not last long. We quickly dropped back to 1280 by 720 at low details. The game picked up a few extra frames and was kind of playable. We don't quite understand how this setup is running so bad. We had this running on an i5 with an older video card. The game didn't run great either, but surely it should run on the Ryzen with the GTX 970. I mean, what's going on here? The CPU and the GPU don't seem to be fully being utilized according to our metrics. Anyway, let's press on. Here's the benchmarks. Average frame rate for Cyberpunk 2077 was 15.4 frames per second. Minimum frame rates hit 10.7 frames per second. Maximum frame rate hit only 37.5 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 5.4 frames per second. We really don't know why this is running so bad. This may be a problem from running one stick of RAM opposed to using both channels, lacking the memory bandwidth. However, I would have thought this game would run a lot better. Anyway, this game is pretty much unplayable at the moment with this setup, and until some optimizations are implemented by update patches, there's nothing more we can do. So let's move on. PUBG gave us a beautiful, crisp and smooth gameplay. We ran this game at 1920 by 1080 at low details, using 100% res scaling. The game never missed a beat. Every frame felt smooth and playable. It looked like the Ryzen CPU did not have a lot of work to do at all. The benchmarks for PUBG are average frame rate 69.2 frames per second. Minimum frame rates hit 41.3 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate hit 105.9 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows hit 21.4 frames per second. Overall, this game ran perfect. PUBG with the GTX 970 and the Ryzen 5 2600 will give you a great gaming experience at 1080p resolutions. And I dare say probably even at 2K with low settings. I personally like to run PUBG at low settings. I feel you can see more with less of a strain to your eyes, with the higher details making everything blend. Plus, a big bonus, you get some beautiful, lovely high smooth frame rates. And you can bet the bank on this one, every gamer loves high frame rates. Moving on to Red Dead Redemption 2. In Red Dead Redemption 2, we ran the game at 1920 by 1080 at low settings using the Vulkan API. The game ran pretty well. Not perfect, but still a fun gaming experience. We did not suffer any real load lag spikes or any major slowdowns in frame rates. In saying that, let's jump into the benchmarks. For Red Dead Redemption 2, average frame rate hits 50.5 frames per second. Minimum frame rates hit 37.4 frames per second, and a maximum frame rate hit 60.8 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit a frame rate of 12.8 frames per second. So this game ran pretty good on this system. Very much playable, that is for sure. Dropping the resolution back to maybe 1280 by 720 will most likely get you a 60 FPS plus experience. But we were quite happy with the approximate 50 frames per second experience. So we give the thumbs up for Red Dead Redemption 2. Next we tried some Star Wars Battlefront 2. This game ran very well. We had Star Wars Battlefront 2 running at 1920 by 1080 with low settings. Though the game was set fairly low on the settings, it still looked very, very pretty. Now, there is something about these games in the Star Wars world. I'm not sure what it is, but it always looks so good. I don't know if this is because of my childhood, just with watching all the Star Wars movies. As a kid, I just loved the whole Star Wars universe. Anyway, nostalgia aside, let's see what this game can do. Frame rates for Star Wars Battlefront 2, average frame rate was 72.9 frames per second. The minimum frame rate hit 44.6 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate hit 118.9 frames per second. Our 0.1% loads hit 14.1 frames per second. Now, like we said, this game just ran great. With no real issues, it felt smooth, and the benchmarks showed exactly just that. So big thumbs up for Star Wars Battlefront 2 and this system. Lastly, the game we have thrown into the barrel of games to play today is Forza Horizon 4. This game has a nice mix of arcade and realism in the car handling department, accompanied by some astonishingly beautiful, picturesque location settings. The graphics in this game really do pop out at you. We ran Forza Horizon 4 at 1920 by 1080 at medium settings. Though we could not get any metrics from the frame rates from our Riva tuner, we could set the game to tell us. This game does have a frame limit of 60 FPS, and this is probably set via the monitor's max refresh rate, thus being 60 frames per second for us. The game gave us pretty much smooth gameplay, giving us a 60 FPS experience for all the game, though we did experience frame timing slowdowns from time to time, but nothing that really wrecked our gaming experience. Now this is a great game for this system, and we could play this for hours on end. Now you can pick this game up as part of the Xbox Game Pass at the moment, and probably for some time yet to come. It really is a nice game to play, where you can pace yourself on challenges, or you can go on gentle drives or violent cruises through the countryside. It's up to you to decide. But what we can tell you about this game, on the R5 2600 with the GTX 970, you'll get a nice playing experience. Now, I want to wrap up the system. The AMD Ryzen 5 2600, in my thoughts, has always been a great value CPU. With 6 cores and 12 threads to help out in games that can support so many threads, which is not a lot, or any that we know of, yet. But having the extra few threads over 4 anyway, in our experience, definitely helps out in games like PUBG or anything that pretty much uses the Unreal 4 engine and a few other engines that are out there. The single performance still is very good for gaming, though it is not as strong as Intel's counterparts from the same era in time. If you are doing any video editing or 3D CAD work, like SolidWorks or anything like that, the extra cores and threads do make a big difference. And this system's not what you'd call a top-end gaming system to today's standards, but it will do a good job for 3D CAD and video editing. Though, I'd imagine you should look at probably for more RAM for 3D cab work, because I know you need a stack with some of those 3D cab packages. You're probably going to need more than 8 gig anyway. As for the GTX 970, this card still can do 1080p gaming, well, most of the games. Let's not think about what was going on in Cyberpunk. Though the GTX 970 is not a high performance card, but still probably good enough with performance similar to the GTX 1060s or the RX 570 cards. If you like high detail settings on high resolutions than 1080p, you should look at something way more powerful. The Strix card, though we have not tried overclocking it, it seemed to have adequate enough cooling for the gaming we did today. Though at the OFFbit, we do have an open test bench setup. An enclosed system would give you different results and could vary quite vastly depending on your case layout and cooling ventilation setup. I would definitely be happy using this system as a daily machine, though I'd definitely be using 2 sticks of RAM in my system to get that extra memory bandwidth. Because in my opinion, that extra bandwidth can make big differences in frame rates in 3D games. I'd like to thank you once again for watching our show here at the OFFbit. If you like this video, please hit that like button. Also, if you haven't subscribed and you enjoy the content that we produce here at the OFFbit, hit that subscribe button as well. Also, feel free to leave a comment. We're always open-eared to suggestions from our community. We try to make this channel what you guys are looking for in a show. So we thank you once again for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time on the OFFbit.